Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 12 of the We're Young But Just Us podcast, as a part of the Sports Opinions Network of podcasts. Today, I talked to legendary writer John Jackson Miller, who is famous for writing Star Wars books and novels, Star Trek, Iron Man, Mass Effect, and he is also the curator of Comichron.com, a site dedicated to analysis of comic sales throughout history. And that's what we talk about today, the history of his website, distribution and the history of comic sales in general, the current market and where sales were before the crisis and how retailers were reacting, and of course coming out of the situation with multiple publishing houses now. Diamond's not entirely exclusive, as DC Comics has opened up their own publishing line, and we can talk about what that means in relation to history and the world in the 90s where there were multiple publishers. So I found this very informative. I learned a lot of things personally that I did not know about comic sales in its history, and I feel like if you really enjoy numbers like sports statistics, you'll really enjoy this episode and learning about how numbers are tracked in the comics world. So keep staying safe, wash your hands, and enjoy this episode.
Swing drive, right center field. The Braves have won it. Elliott starts right, cuts it upfield, touchdown Dallas. They score! And Reed, it's over. Over for the win. Bam. Got it. And the Scarlet Knights win it. They're in pandemonium in Piscataway.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of We're Young But Just Us podcast. Today, I have the pleasure to welcome, he's a writer on many the properties you've known, including Star Wars. He did Knights of the Old Republic, Mass Effect, Iron Man, an Indiana Jones movie prequel comic. And another awesome fact is he is the curator of Comichron.com, which collects Diamond data on comic sales. So which basically Comichron is one of the best source for knowing comic sales, and that is the curator John Jackson Miller. How you doing?
Hey, I'm doing fine.
Doing great. We're all living through this, trying to just make it through. And
I work at home normally, so the only difference for me is that I spent the entire winter locked in the house writing a novel, and I was hoping to get out.
As they said, I don't know. I think I've seen a million different artists say, is everyone just trying to be comic artists now? We're all locked in, staying away from everyone.
I was lucky I got to do one show last weekend in February in Richmond, and I had this huge slate lined up for 2020, and boy, it's just all gone.
Yeah. Oh, goodness. I'm sorry about that. Getting a bunch of updates. Yeah, it's crazy right now. I know I expected, to go to something this month in New Jersey, which looked to be cool with the East Coast Comic-Con. But, that all like that and all sports out the window right now. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of all that, of all the market and everything, I want to go over just the origins of Comic-Con. Like, what made you want to get into tracking comic sales?
Well, I as a kid, I started collecting comics at age 6, and where other people's mothers threw their comics away, my mother was a librarian, and so she encouraged me to put my comics in order. So I can remember even at like age 8, sorting my little Harvey and Gold Key comics by publisher and by alphabetical order, by title, and then by issue. Then through high school, I developed a sort of a library accession list to track what I had and how many copies I had and what days I got them and where I got them from. As I grew older and became a journalist, I didn't keep that level of detail anymore, but I still tracked what was going on in the business because, in high school, I had discovered Comics Buyer's Guide, the newspaper that was out there that was sort of a publication that was read by fans and pros alike, run by Don and Maggie Thompson. And when I got into the working world after having done a really unhappy year as editor of line of magazines for a different commodity, lumber. I got the chance to go up and interview for the sister publication to Comics Buyer's Guide. It was a magazine called Comics Retailer. It had started in 1991, I believe, with the purpose of tracking this booming industry that the comics industry was really heading to its peak in 1993. And I was hired as the editor of Comics Retailer, working alongside Don and Maggie. Don passed away not too long after I got there, unfortunately, but I continued to work, with the publication and with the consumer magazine Comics Buyer's Guide for over a decade. And in that period, I was able to take some of my interests in tracking how many comics were out there, and I was able to develop the beginnings of a database of what existed, and it was also in that period where we had the distribution wars, where it was no longer possible to get all comics from any one distributor. So in 1996, I arranged with Marvel to provide me the sales figures that were of the comics that they were doing through Heroes World Distribution. That allowed me to begin a unified chart that had everything in it, sort of harmonized everything. To this day, the Excel file that I use is still called Harmony, because it brought together Diamond and Heroes World, and then of course Heroes World folds and Diamond has everything. But I just kept doing that, and even after I was promoted out of the magazines and started my own comics writing career and my own novel writing career, and eventually left the company and to do my own thing, I kept doing these numbers because I wanted to sort of preserve that information. I wanted to be able to tell people what is the real story. I mean, everybody on the internet has their own view of what comics should be like and what the business should be like and how they should be sold, and everybody uses various facts and figures to support their case, and a lot of what people knew was just not correct. That was certainly the case 20 years ago, when they were still running articles in Fortune magazine about how great comics were as a business, over a year after it had started to collapse.
That's ironic.
Well, the information just wasn't out there. It just wasn't public. And, another reason that I thought people needed to see this data is because of that crash. And this was something that Steve Jeppy, the founder of Diamond, mentioned in this great podcast that was yesterday, as we were recording this. That was a period in which speculation was rampant, and a lot of people thought that the comics that they bought were going to fund their college education, and they just didn't know how many existed. They didn't know what the supply was. So they had no way of really gauging what the real price was. We were in the price guide business at Krause Publications, but price guides kind of are an after the fact kind of a thing. I mean, after the sales have been made, you get to know what things are worth. If you know up front that there are, 500,000 copies of Detective Comics 1000, you're probably not going to bet the farm on it. And so, it's something where I think that it's helpful to the business, both in real time to have this information out there. And then also it's helpful historically, so that people can understand what the picture was like, what we've gone through. And so again, when I quit the day job in 2007 to write full time, I just moved my archives, everything that I was working on and had been working on, that never, I did a lot of stuff that never even appeared at the Krause magazines. I just moved all of that to Comichron.com. It was originally called the Comics Chronicles, and of course, you realize after about 5 minutes on the internet that the shorter the name is, the better.
Exactly. So, question about the obtaining of numbers in your research to go into it. Can you tell me a little bit about that process and how do you obtain the numbers?
Well, there are 5 or 6 different data sets that I'm working with. The one that people are most familiar with is the monthly sales charts from Diamond. I'll circle back to those in a minute, but I also work with a lot of other data. There's a phenomenon that is peculiar to American magazines, where if you sell your magazine by subscription and you ship it periodical class, by law, you have to say how many copies you sold on average in a form that's in the magazine every year. And so that's called a statement of ownership. If you go back and look at old comics from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, you will find these things usually hidden on the letters page. And they're, very small type and indecipherable. There were over 4,000 of these. I now have almost all of them. And so I have a good idea of sales back to 1960.
Wow.
So that's one thing. Some of that is on the Comichron site in a section called Postal Sales, which is reachable via the yearly sales section. But I have not updated it in a long time because I have a much bigger update coming that's going to encompass that and some other material. I also have traveled to the headquarters of the company that used to be the Audit Bureau of Circulation. Almost all magazines that have advertising are audited, which is to say, if you sell advertising and you say, hey, you buy an ad in my magazine, you're going to get 3 million readers. Well, the people that buy the ads want to know whether that's true or not. And so there are these third parties, what used to be the Audit Bureau and another one called BPA, where they go out and they actually will go in the offices and look at the records. And they will do an annual audit report and say, here's what they really sold. Well, they've been doing that for comics since 1938.
Superman. Wow.
And they stopped only recently. DC and Marvel finally dropped out because they no longer really make their money selling ads. Same way, they don't run the postal the forums anymore because their comics don't send they don't send their comics through periodical class anymore. Actually, Midtown Comics mails them for them to their subscribers.
So one question actually off of that. So when they do these black label books that are straight just straight story, no ads in it, they really don't lose anything compared to the regular periodicals?
Well, I mean, they make some money. I mean, there's still some ads. But the way that we used to sell comics advertising, it wasn't like you buy an ad in Conan. No, you would buy an ad in all of Marvel's superhero titles. And they would bundle that together into a big thing. And deciphering what's actually in the basket of sales each month is one of the things that I've been working on. But one of the things that happened is basically, the numbers got lower, and as the numbers got lower, even when they were all bundled together, comics weren't as great a buy as they had been. And so, but that's true for all advertising in all magazines. But it was the case that, ads were a bigger profit center for comics. One of the things that happened is, people got more demanding about their comics. They didn't like the idea that there were a bunch of ads in the middle of the comic book. Kicking ads out of comics, that was one of the first things people started doing in the 1980s, with sort of these more deluxe, printings and imprints. So yeah, I mean, there's that. Anyway, the Audit Bureau is just another source of information. I have a lot of data that has come from the publishers themselves. Some distributors that have closed down have given me everything they had. And so I've got that available. And then, of course, we have these monthly sales charts. And where that comes from is in 1984, I guess it was, Capital City Distribution, which was in Madison, Wisconsin, and was until the end, it was pretty much the number 2 distributor in comics for the direct market. They started running a sales chart that had an index in it. So it actually had a little a number there that said if you bought if a retailer here's our sales, here's our rankings, and for every 100 copies of X-Men that retailers bought, that our customers bought, they bought 120 copies of Crisis on Infinite Earths. And they didn't want to say how many copies they exactly sold because they didn't want their competitors to know that and all of that. But they wanted their retailers to know, hey, this Crisis on Infinite Earths book must be pretty good if the average retailer is selling, 20% more copies than they're selling of X-Men or buying of X-Men. And so they started running these monthly. That has continued. Diamond picked it up in the early 90s, running these order index numbers, and they've run them ever since. And the trick is, everybody has always known, all you have to do to unlock what the sales for the industry are is to know roughly what any of the comics in the list sell. And so it's a bit like, I guess, a Sudoku puzzle, but you can actually work it out. I mean, the information is there. It would be like, I know you have a sports podcast. If you had the slugging percentage and then you had a few other pieces of information, you could figure out somebody's batting average from it.
Yeah.
So it's something where they've continued to view it as valuable for retailers to be able to see, hey, look, this is what these things are selling relative to each other. And then what happened is, this information just started getting out. In the 1990s, when the internet came along, one of my colleagues just started printing the rankings as he had computed them, and I was already doing them. I decided to take it all onto first Comics Buyer's Guide, the website we had, and then to Comichron. Again, the thing with these charts, and the March ones just came out today as we're recording this. They are really valued by different people for different reasons. My traffic, about half of it is people who care about the horse race. What's selling well? Is this going to get canceled? What is it? The other half is from collectors and historians who want to know what things used to sell, what the original supply was. One of my most popular pages is from the month that Walking Dead #1 came out, because everybody's wants to know, hey, look at that. I mean, it's 8,000 copies or whatever it was. We want to see this. And so, these charts have had to serve a lot of different purposes, but their real reason for existing is for the retailers. And a lot of people treat them like a scoreboard. Hey, these don't include all sales. They're not supposed to include all sales. They're not a scoreboard. The purpose of the numbers is to help retailers in deciding what they're going to carry. It's a commodity report. It tells them what's available out there. It's a commodity report, just like the lumber sales reports I used to run. We were not out there trying to prove, hey, look, Western red cedar is a more popular lumber than Eastern white pine. It was the retailers needed to know for their business what was out there.
So you're saying that 9.5x with number one could be like 12 million?
Well, it's one of those things. Everybody uses it for different things, and so and there's just a lot more information out there. The CGC numbers, those came along. CGC came along in the early 2000s. I covered that very heavily for Comics Buyer's Guide, and we in fact put them in our first we put them in our first comics price guides that I also integrated the sales charts in, which was called a standard catalog comic book series. And the whole idea is, there's a network of information now. We know how many copies existed of something in the beginning, and we also know from CGC how many copies existed, now, or how many still exist, and in what grades. And we know from eBay, what the interest is in them. So it's somewhere between all of this. There's this network of information that's always changing. It is the case that publishers and certainly creators will get out there and say, "Hey, look at me, look at what I'm selling." And sometimes they'll say, "Hey, we're selling a lot more than appears on your charts." But the fact is, that may be true, and in fact, it certainly is true. I've told them that if the Comichron Diamond charts listed everything they sold, then they're wrong. The charts are wrong. The information is wrong, because we know it doesn't include everything. It doesn't include anything outside of North America, because North American retailers do not need to know what UK retailers sold. That's not part of the same marketplace in terms of the comics leaking back from one market into the other. You're talking about quite a bit of money just in shipping, to get a comic book from last week from England. It's not something that normally happens. It's something where you also have those monthly reports. They don't include sales outside the calendar month, so they will have reorders that will show up that will break into the top 500. It's easier now because there's 500. There used to be a top 100 in the very beginning. Usually now around 400th place, you'll start to see a lot of reordered comics that were from 2 or 3 months ago. But in general, if your book comes out in the last week of the month, you're at a disadvantage in those charts than if you came out the first week of the month, because that first week's books have had more time on the stands, and more reorders have shipped, more copies have cycled. And so that's one of the reasons I say, a lot of people, you'll see on various sites, people will take the numbers from Comichron or ICV2, and they'll try to line them up in a thing saying, okay, here's what sales on Radioactive Man 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Just to make
good reference.
Just to make up a comic book that never had an issue 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. But what they'll do is they'll take all those numbers from the diamond charts, and they'll put them in, and they'll try to use them to say, hey, look at this comic book, it's heading towards cancellation or something, or it's trending upward. Well, the fact is, we already know there's a lot of volatility in the charts. For one thing, as I've mentioned, nothing that was not in the calendar, month is counted. So, for example, February, a comic book, might have sales of 100,000 copies. March, it might have sales of 90,000 copies. You say it's dropping. Well, we might find out that in February, that comic book came out in week 1. And in March, that comic book came out in week 4. And in fact, their sales were exactly equal. It's just that the week 4 book had its other 10,000 copies in April. And so that's why I say this is a very noisy, volatile data set. Where we get the most use out of it is the relative rankings from title to title are pretty good, and the aggregate rankings of everything that sold in the business, that is also very good as well. But again, even there, you get into calendar things like the month of April. If we had new comics out in the month of April, I can already tell you April 2020 would have been better than April 2019 if there had not been a coronavirus epidemic. Because what does April 2020 have that April 2019 didn't have? Pop quiz.
Okay, I don't know. All my only thing is X-Men. Like a hype X-Men.
April 2020 has today. What is today? Today is the 5th Wednesday of the month.
Oh my God! I can't now. Yep. Over my head. I should delete.
No, it's really easy. It's really easy. So what we have found over the years is that just having the 5th Wednesday adds about 12 to 14% to the sales of everything overall. It may not add that much to individual titles, but that extra week in there means that it captures more comics.
Isn't this typically annual week?
Well, it used to be just a skip week. It used to be nothing. But the thing is, and it used to not be that bumpy because publishers would not increase the number of titles that they did in the month. But the fact is, when you've got 500 comic books coming out a month, it almost doesn't matter what the publishers intended, because a number of comics will just, by virtue of what the printers do, land in that 5th week. And it'll get distributed across that. And then, of course, you have reorders. So if there's more chances for reorders to get shipped with your books, that's going to increase as well. So again, this is why I say I try not to do cross-time tracking on titles, especially since we're now in an age where the comic book itself is not the sole source of revenue for a property. I mean, the cross-time rankings would be useful for the collector to a point, but in terms of telling the health of a series, well, the one that everybody was always looking at was Ms. Marvel, and they would say, well, look at the sales of Ms. Marvel, the comic book. Well, once Ms. Marvel got to around 5 graphic novels, it almost didn't matter what the individual issues sold, because the purpose of the individual issues was to create new comics to appear in the graphic novels, which they have sold over 500,000 of. The relative portion of that comic book's revenue coming from the individual comic book, once you have a graphic novel series from it, is much, much smaller. And really the purpose of the comic book at that point is to advertise the series and to make sure that the work continues to get done.
You track those too, so what's that like? Because I know there's multiple publishing houses for those, and they also go to bookstores. So what's that like for you?
The bookstore market, we track along with ICV2, which is actually the successor to the publication put out by Capital City Distribution back in the 80s that started the numbers. The book channel, as it's known, which is Amazon, Walmart, Barnes & Noble, all the independent bookstores, that's booming, and it's really booming. They were up dramatically in 2019. The direct market was up slightly in 2019, but the book channel was way up. So, but again, this is what I always say to people is that they say, well, then we don't need comic books anymore. Nonsense. 90% of what is on the shelf at Barnes & Noble, where did it come from?
The periodicals.
Came from periodicals. The work just won't get done. I write comic books. I do occasionally get hired to write a graphic novel that is not originally collected in issues. Last year, I did graphic novels for Lion King, and also for Dumbo, even the movies. And they were original graphic novels released in that format. And in those cases, they did pay me to go away and write 60 pages all at once. But most of the business is predicated on, the other comic I had out last year, I did a Battlestar Galactica series for the 40th anniversary. And on that, you get paid by the individual issue, which makes sure you get the thing done, and, advertises and sells, gets some revenue coming in on the books before the graphic novel comes out. Most creators cannot go away for 6 months to write or draw a 120-page book without any revenue coming in. And most publishers don't want to work that way either. This is actually an advantage we have over regular books. This fact that we can serialize it throughout the individual issues is colossal. Novels. A lot of novels in the 19th century didn't begin as novels. None of the Sherlock Holmes novels began as novels. They were magazine articles. They were serialized. Same for the stuff by Charles Dickens. He had a newsletter. So if you ever read, Great Expectations or Tale of Two Cities or whatever, it was actually coming out in his newsletter. It was serialized. It was, there was something prodding him to get it done, and it was building an audience before anybody ever tried to sell it as a book. And that's what we got. And it's actually a pretty good system. The average sales of comic books, the actual comic books, have not changed a lot over the last 20 years. It's in the 6 to 8 million copy a month range. But that's enough. That is apparently enough to be able to fuel all of the ancillary stuff that we've made. The graphic novels, which are now a larger part of the business than the comic books themselves, and they have also fueled the digital. That digital was money that didn't exist in this business 10 years ago, and it does not appear to be money that came out of demand for the physical comic books. Sales on both have gone up over the last decade.
How do you track? That's another question. I didn't want to dive too deep into it because there's obviously more pressing topics that I wanted to get into. But just like at a quick note of it, are you going to be able to track those? Because that's been a major question: is tracking these numbers. Are they ever going to come out?
Well, digital is a bit of a black box because nobody has ever. We haven't had anything like the dynamics in comics. Comics is actually a very transparent business relative to some other fields. In comics, because of the advertising thing, because of the fact that they're collectibles and retailers needed to know, what the prices of these, or rather what the quantities of these commodities were in the market. We developed this system of having a lot of information out there. Digital has never really had that, and in many cases, the publishers themselves are selling the books, so they have no impetus whatsoever, or no requirement to provide anything. However, my partner in the annual report is ICV2. They were very early on this. In fact, Milton Greep, the founder of ICV2, was one of the original principals with Comixology. And so, he has a better handle on that business. And so we kind of have an idea of what the sales are for the comics, digital sales are for the comics that are sold outright, where it's, you're buying it to own, as opposed to the subscription services like Marvel Unlimited, where we just don't have a clue. We know it can't be too big because we kind of have a notion of what the royalties are that the creators are getting. And we kind of see that dynamic as well from some of the streaming services with television. I mean, you would think there's a lot of money in it, but it gets divided up across so many different titles, or episodes or whatever it is. That nobody is really going to the bank. What it all is worth together, we don't know. I don't know that we will ever know. There are still some portions of print comics that we just don't have a handle on. We know that a ridiculous number of graphic novels are sold to libraries, and we just don't have a handle on that. Milton does, as part of the book channel, talk with people in the book fair trade. The book fairs are Scholastic will have the book fairs in schools. Mm-hmm. And there's, that's where a lot of these books are going, where, people will say, hey, these comics, the individual comics aren't selling that much in the comic shops. Yeah, you're just not where these books are selling. They're sold in collected edition, and they're sold to the kids, and they're sold in schools. They're sold in places you don't see.
It's crazy. I knew there was the digital unknown, but I did not have knowledge that within what you track, there's a huge unknown.
Oh,
That's crazy.
Oh, yeah.
So to get into the topic at hand, obviously, is 2020 and the coronavirus. And Arian, there's multiple questions I definitely want to get into in terms of the market itself and, of course, publishing. So I guess the first off is, based on your numbers and what you have, where did you see that people, or I guess actually no, in this case, the buyers or the retailers, that retailers saw that they were cutting back before it all shut down?
Okay. Through the end of February, we were actually up for the year. It was always going to be a challenge beating March of 2019 because that had
Detective, right?
Detective 1000. And, there's some debate there. Well, Detective 1000, if people didn't buy that, they would have bought something else. I don't know that that's fully true, because when it comes to those big books like Detective 1000 or Action 1000 or something like that, where it's a $5 million book, retailers do pull some money from the other comic books they might have bought instead. But they also pull in some money from outside of comics. They don't order that many Funkos that month. They don't order that many, statues that month or something like that. There's some outside money that comes in just because you have a high-profile thing. I can guarantee you the huge boom we had in late 2011 when the New 52 happened, that was money that was not on the sidelines, just waiting for the right product. That was already money that was in the shops. It was money they'd pulled from other things, games or whatever else it was. And if there had not been a New 52, if there had not been a Detective 1000, those individual months would not have been as big as they were. So, yeah, I think it does matter when you have these big high-profile things in the comparatives. It does matter to say, as we found out in the month of March, the sales were almost identical with February in terms of sales to retailers. That's the important thing to remember. The diamond charts are sales to retailers, what they shipped, what they ordered, and what they shipped. So the sales were almost identical for February. They normally would have been higher because as the year goes on, as the winter goes on, publishers increase their production. They put out more titles for when they expect people will be there. Once you get to the last week of March, you're past spring break and you're into the spring season. Heading towards Free Comic Book Day, you're starting to see the volume of titles go up, and so the sales should be going up. March in a normal year should beat February. In fact, it was almost exactly the same size as February, $37 million. And it was 15% lower than last March. But again, I'll note last March had Detective 1000 in there. And if you didn't have Detective 1000 in there, and also if they hadn't spent the money on something else, then March is actually ahead. But the key is we're not going to pretend like March was a good month, because March, that's the sales to retailers. That's what they were betting as they were heading into the year. The initial orders for March are coming in at the end of January, when there's no epidemic that anybody's really aware of.
Okay.
Once we get into late February and early March, though, retailers have some information, and so they're able to adjust their orders downward. Any of the books that are on final order cutoff, they can cut way back on. And then you had the phenomenon of a number of stores that knew that they were closing. They were able to just park their accounts and say, Diamond, don't ship me anything else. And so, the ramifications are in our charts. Sales were down about 15% from this March versus previous March. But the interesting thing that I found, and this is in the charts that can be seen on the March 2020 page on Comichron, you always have to kind of examine your prior assumptions. And when I got these numbers in the beginning, I was like, okay, well, I assume if I break this thing down by week, that sales would have trailed off through the month. People would have ordered less and less. In fact, the opposite happened. And the reason is because those publishers made those publishing schedules, 6 months ago. And they were all expecting a normal March. And so, the last week of March actually had more new comics shipping in it than any week in 2020 so far. And
interesting dynamic there.
Retailers ordered fewer of them. Retailers ordered significantly fewer of them. So I have two charts: the number released per week, and then the average sales. The average sales for the week were per title, per new release. Those average sales were actually lower than any week in the last 2 months. But if you add all those comics together, retailers actually had greater volume shipped to them the last week in last week in March than in any other week in March. And of course, this is all stuff coming in. Retailers are often not able to sell it. It underscores that there is a significant issue that will come along. And Steve Geppi was asked about it yesterday in this online forum of, what do we do with all these comics? There's this backlog that has to go out. And, it is helpful that a number of things, a number of publishers have had the opportunity to just flat out cancel the books that were going to be printed at this point and reschedule them because that's going to be an issue going forward. I do want to underscore, it does not look to me like anything was pulled into March from April. When I say that more new comics came out in the fourth week, I don't think it was because of anything other than the natural dynamic that publishers have, that as the temperatures warm up, the shelves get crowded.
It's crazy looking at it's crazy thinking about all that information I didn't know before, just about March. I really never thought about how in advance they did it. So I guess the question before I get into the publishing aspect of it and the news that's come out of that is, compared to I guess three specific periods I'm looking at, and in this I'm looking specifically at the comic bust in '90, and then and then post 9/11 and the recession, the most recent recession in 2007, 8, 9. How, like, is this going to be those levels of numbers when they eventually come back, or is it going to be worse?
Well, I'll tell you this: the numbers on I was prepared for the March numbers to make no sense, and they were strange, but it looked relatively normal on this end because these are orders placed in advance. April, I have no idea what's going to happen with. March, who knows? Or I'm sorry, May, who knows how much material is going to be out there. I don't think the comparatives are going to be very useful for about 6 months. I just don't think we're going to know. And that is because you have a lot of different dynamics going on. You've got stores that are in states that are not open yet. Wisconsin, where I'm at, we will not be open by May 20th. When the diamond books are supposed to start flowing again. We don't know, what publishers are going to be fully staffed and running yet at that point. We don't know. There's just a lot of question marks. A lot of retailers are waiting for capital. They're waiting for their loans to come in, their PPP assistance to come in. So there's just a whole lot of dynamics happening right now. And it's just, you don't get in and do the battle damage assessment while the bullets are still flying. To use a metaphor, or while or you don't survey the damage from the storm. That's a better one.
Yeah, there you go.
While the winds are still blowing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's certainly not a good time to remodel the house. You do that afterward. You do that after you see what's happened. That's that. So yeah, I think the bad weather is a better one. And we have had incidents in the United States where winter weather and hurricanes have shut down comics distribution for a week or two in certain parts of the country. And we know how to start that back up again. This is something new, though. You mentioned the Apollo 13 reference at one point. That I've made. I don't know what it looks like to restart this business, so I cannot tell anybody, a corresponding thing in the past. And again, I'm really more about the past and not the future. I'm more about what the comparatives are. The crash of the early 90s. This is not like that. That was an oversupply in the number of stores. That came out of a credit bubble. That came out of the fact that there were way too many distributors, and they were, clawing at each other and offering ridiculous terms to any, lunatic who wanted to open a comic shop. And in some cases, they were lunatics. I mean, it was what was going on back then is that there were street fights, not literal, but in between various distributors in various parts of the country, where you would have field reps going into stores, and they would find the assistant manager or the employee that was most disgruntled. And they would say, "Hey, we will open you up in a shop across the street.
Oh my!
We don't
goodness.
care. We don't care that you don't have good credit rating. We just want to take out your opponent, or we want your business." And I remember this happened in Memphis, where we ballooned from like 2 or 3 stores to something like 12 or 14. There were 2 cases in town where the distributors had competing stores across the street from one another. One of those stores was in a psychiatrist's office.
Wow.
in a medical office building. He at least had a building or an office. A lot of other people were actually selling the comics out of the back of their cars. People say there were 11,000 stores back then. No, there were 11,000 accounts is what we think there were buying comics, not necessarily stores. And so you had, and they might have had accounts with multiple distributors. But I mean, you had a situation. There was a comic shop, one of those in that thing where there was a comic shop across from one of the old established shops. It opened in 1993. It was selling its comics at 45% off on the rack.
Whoa.
Well, the math said
That's not going to be good.
Well, the math says that if he's getting like a 50% discount, he has to sell 9 out of 10 copies to make any money. That was not happening.
What did Steve Geppi say when he got into Diamond? It was like 18 or 21 distributors. I think that's what he mentioned.
Yeah, they were probably handling different parts of the business. Yeah, I mean, it was. I generally count in 1993. There were either 11 or 12 really serious distributors, and some of them were Canadian. Members of, there was actually an association, the International Association of Direct Distributors. And their very last meeting was the one where Marvel came in and said, we own Heroes World. And DC said, we're not going to talk to anybody at this meeting because Marvel's here. That was the last meeting that event ever had, or that organization ever had. That was in 1994. So that was kind of a whole different thing. You asked about the recession. You asked about 9/11. 9/11 was really interesting in that, of course, it didn't really entail any disruptions except for in the New York area, obviously, and maybe in DC in terms of shipping. But when it hit right at the end of that recession in comics that had lasted since '93 when the bubble burst, and it could have been a bad thing, but a number of dynamics were helping us in comics. The graphic novel had sort of caught on as this place to, take some of the pressure off the individual comic books. Marvel was out of bankruptcy and getting its act together because it had just done the Ultimate Spider-Man book, and so they had that going. And actually, the big book that came out that I consider really to be the start of the revival in the 2000s was Wolverine: The Origin #1. That came out the Wednesday before 9/11. And so 9/11, in fact, did not stop there from being this revival in comics. In fact, it became a bit of a part of it. The response became a bit of a part of it because you had Amazing Spider-Man 36 come out as a memorial issue. You had the Marvel and DC and Dark Horse did these memorial books that were out there. And it was kind of a rallying point. So, that disaster doesn't really give us, much in terms of, what the financial impact was. But what it does give us is a picture of what might come from this in terms of a rallying point, benefit books, that sort of thing. That could come out of this. And then 2008, 2009, we actually kind of got hit late by that recession. We were in the middle of a still pretty good times from the early 2000s boom that went through Civil War and Infinite Crisis in those books. And, it wasn't really until, late 2009, 2010, part of what was going on there was, there's a price change. That was about when everything was going from $2.99 to $3.99. So there were just a number of things going on there. And then the New 52 happened in September of 2011, and it was like flipping a light switch. And we were off to the races again.
So we basically, I know you said it, we mentioned it off when we first started talking about you coming on. You said you're not the future guy, you're a lot of the past guy. So I know asking that, obviously nobody can really predict what the numbers will return to once May 20th and past comes out, because of course states will be open, states won't be open. It's just a wild west of distribution in terms of all mediums, comics, just everything in terms of whatever gets distributed. And then speaking, before we move on, the quote that he mentioned, because I think we talked about it off the air, was John mentioned in the chat yesterday of the Steve Jeppy Q&A. This is like Apollo 13. Systems that were never designed to be shut down have to be brought back online in the right order. That was the quote that he mentioned in the stream yesterday that I screenshot. I was like, no, I have to bring it up today.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely believe it. I actually, when this all started, I remember tweeting on my personal account a quote from Mission Control in that movie where the head of Mission Control says, "Okay, what do we got on the spaceship that works?" Taking stock because everything was going wrong, and I think what we have right now is a system where, money is designed to come in every week. Product is designed to come in every week. Things are at different stages at different places. And what pretty much everybody in America decided to do is, once they realized the score here, it was like, okay, let's just freeze. If we owed you money, we're gonna wait until we see what's going to happen. And in some cases, the government has stepped in to cover that. In some cases, you've got banks that are willing to say, okay, you can hold off on your mortgage or whatever. It's obviously not a uniform thing, but this is something where the comics industry did not cause this problem. No matter what you may read or see or hear anywhere, the direct market was in pretty good shape at the beginning of 2020, and the comics market in general, including graphic novels, the graphic novel market was just going blockbuster. It was going really, really well. And we did not cause this problem, and we will not alone be able to fix this problem. It's going to require the rest of the world to get straightened out, but we can do our part.
Before we move on, I know you said we're kind of at that hour mark. How are you on time?
My son has not yelled at me yet about taking up his internet bandwidth, so I guess I should be okay.
Before we close it out and I ask you just about your future projects, I did want to ask your opinions on DC Comics and their publishing routes right now. And because I'm kind of baffled, because everyone I've seen, it just seems like every comic store that I've seen comment on it it's all negative. So I just want your take on all this and what you've been hearing.
I think this came up a bit in the discussion yesterday, and if people haven't seen this, Dan Shaheen did Shaheen did this discussion with Steve Jeppy on YouTube. It's definitely worth checking out. It comes up at one point where there's a mention made of, there's a class of comic shop that might be suburban. It might be, really, really heavily targeted toward the bookshelf, that for which the new comics rack rather, for which having a steady supply of brand new books getting people in every week is a big deal. There are a lot of other kinds of comic shops that are diversified in other ways where, if you don't see anything new on the rack, we have all these other books, or we have other things, like we're a game store, or we're a, we've got toys, or we've got other stuff. Those are stores that are more insulated from a shutdown of new material coming in for the rack. I think DC, it's obvious that by making the decision they did, it is of value to them to try to serve those customers in the interim. It's every publisher is looking at this differently. Every publisher has a different appetite for or a different tolerance level for being off the shelves. Every publisher sees different opportunities at different times. I will say that I did the math on the first 3 weeks of books that had been announced. Since they are holding back the really big characters, Superman, Batman, the big books, we're not talking about a very large portion even of DC's business that is in play with this. So I think I figured that the books for the first 2 or 3 weeks were just a couple of percentage points on the overall comics market in February. So again, we will see. There are advantages to having multiple distributors. As we saw in the early 1990s, there were disadvantages, and Steve got into a bit of that, a bit of the arms race that went on. Capital and Diamond together, both of them had something like 25 warehouses around the country. They had their own trucking fleets. They were flying comics all over the place to get them there for the customers that wanted them. Because we did have a market where there were so many shops, it was a competitive advantage to get them the day before or an hour before. It's not entirely clear that this is that market anymore, or that one question we might ask is if there are people that have to have the next chapter of the story right away. Have those people already gone to webcomics, or rather the internet, the digital comics? That's a question. We just don't know the answer to these things. This is what I say. This is what I mean when I say this could be 6 months before we really know, what anything means. And I'm not certain that, the annual comparatives that I run on Comichron may even appear in the same way, shape, or form. It's common that those numbers get used without any context about what was going on 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 40 years ago. And you can't really put that in just a little listing in the sidebar. It's got to be explained in the text. And I'm just going to make sure that people try to read they do need to read the article and not just look at the numbers.
Oops, I got caught.
That's all right.
I need to read more of the article. Your site's one of those addictions. I remember I used to be addicted to, I still am, Baseball Reference, and I found the comic equivalent to Baseball Reference. So I just dig through all of that.
Well, I think it's important, but it's also important to actually have that context. I mean, all right, if you're comparing football statistics from now to the football statistics, how long is it ago now? 35 years ago, or 34 years ago. You'd say, hey, look at these numbers versus those numbers. Well, you might be comparing with the strike year, where there's replacement players.
Yeah.
In the NFL. Or in baseball, there's the live ball era, as they call it, or you could be comparing against the era when all the players were juiced. I mean,
yeah,
it's these things. The context has to kind of be known, it's one of those things where sometimes just the number doesn't tell you the story.
All right. So to close out the meaty and gritty part of it, you did mention, I guess, the comparisons, because and you were hearing a lot of it. So you put out tweets, I want to say earlier last week, or maybe it was last week, about the comparisons of DC Comics publishing to Heroes World and how it's not the same at all. You want to just dive into that to just close it out?
Yeah, I mean that was looking at what percentage of the business these things were, and when Heroes World was bought by Marvel, Heroes World was at that time serving about 10% of the stores in the country, or 10% of the volume. These two firms, DCBS and Midtown together, Diamond's two biggest customers, together account for about 10% of Diamond's comic sales. So, these are I don't know that means anything. That's just these are the scales we're talking about here. And as for what the prospects are, what the future looks like, I do think it's a complex question, how it's going to work out. As Steve mentioned, these companies are his competitors, but they're also his customers.
He did mention that pretty emphatically. I remember that.
Yeah, and I'm wondering. I assume that they're getting their DC Comics for their retail customers from their own distribution side, but I don't know that. Somebody's probably done that interview already. I think these are a lot of questions. I mean, I don't know that. I don't know that the statistics are going to be really helpful in this for a long time, where we're going to be able to say, hey, look, look at these numbers. This obviously means that this portion of DC's business has been pulled away. I don't know that we're going to be able to tell that. I don't know that the numbers are going to be, valid and reliable. Validity is, is the thing you're looking at what you're looking at? I mean, are you correctly defining what you're looking at? And reliable is this repeatable? Is this measure, can this measure be used anywhere else? Is this reliable from month to month? When I was in grad school taking statistics for social science, these were the questions you had to be able to ask any data set that you were looking at, any theory that you were going to advance. I try to use that now on Comichron, to not simply look at a fact that comes out and say, well, this is explained by that. It's often a bunch of different things, and it may not be easy to know what the impact of any of this stuff is. I say 6 months, it could be 6 years.
You never know. It's like everything. It's like with this, it's changing every day. So thank you very much for taking the time to talk with me, John. It's been great. Just to close it out, let's do the site first. I know we're going to the site first. You mentioned you and this is just from Twitter. You mentioned it in the show too. You're working on something crazy. Do you want to go into that, or is that just going to out?
Comichron.com is the website. Twitter is Comichron, Comichron. There's also a Facebook page, and we have a Patreon and for Comichron. It's just now starting up, but I do on there get a little bit into what I have been working on. I'm spending a lot of time now handling the numbers that I have from the 1960s, and basically doing a lot of analysis that has had to wait for a break. I do the sales figures in between writing my books, and this is an occasion where I've got the time. Excuse me. So it's something where I can't say for sure exactly where this research is going to go, or where it's going to be published, or how it's going to be published, but I already know a lot more than I ever did about sales in the 1960s, and particularly how seasonal those sales were, how much different sales were in the winter versus the summer, and so that's there. And then on the fiction writing side, people can find me. Farawaypress.com is my website. Faraway Press on Twitter, and then just John Jackson Miller on Facebook. And my next novel that's out is out on July 14th. It is a Star Trek Discovery novel. It is called Die Standing, and it follows the Emperor from the Mirror Universe that we meet in the first season of Discovery, as played by Michelle Yeoh, as she goes on her first mission for Section 31, and of course, hiring somebody who used to be, the most powerful person in another universe, an evil universe, to be a spy for you doesn't always work.
All right, well, looking forward to that. That's going to be great, and I'm especially the 1960s numbers because I'm curious on those.
There's some data that's on Comichron already for the 60s. It's just a taste. It's in the yearly comics section.
I can't wait to see what you got coming up. Again, thank you all for listening. This has been the We're Young With Us podcast, episode 12. Make sure to follow me on the new Twitter account for We're Young With Us, WYBJU, the initials of that, and also at Sports Opinions 30 for the main podcast channel that we are, Sports Opinions Podcast. Thank you all for listening. Stay safe, wash your hands, stay inside.